Hello there. I've decided to design a series of fantasy weapons for the channel as a means to further exploring the concept of functional realism in fantasy design. With this project, I wanted to focus on the topic of blade shape as a means of demonstrating a larger point about form following function. I will be creating a fantasy sword from the ground up, starting with an understanding of its martial function. Then I will create a narrative concept for what the weapon's purpose would be, and use this information to create a final painting of the sword. I enjoy seeing unrealistic designs in fantasy from time to time, but I've seen so many beautiful works of craftsmanship from history that I didn't want functional weapon construction to go neglected in my own artwork. Therefore, I would like to design a blade that could exist in our world as well as a fantasy one. Nothing about the sword's construction, shape, or wieldability will be too outside the realm of reality. My hope is that this video will show that realistic doesn't have to be boring or formulaic. There are infinite possibilities when creating fantasy artwork, and there is no need to always resort to absurdity to make a design stand out from the mundane. Before I start the initial concept phase, I want to look through a visual encyclopedia of knives and swords to help me get a baseline of references to help inspire my design. Looking at real-world examples helps me understand basic construction and purpose for my own creation. It also makes it less likely that I'll design something that wouldn't handle or balance well. Sword blades need to find a compromise between cutting and thrusting ability. As a general rule, if a sword has a broader blade, more mass at the point of impact, or curvature along its length, it will prioritize cuts. If a sword has a narrow blade, rigid cross-section, or a thin point in line with the grip, it will favor the thrust. I would like my own design to have a good compromise between cutting and thrusting. However, I think the blade can have more surface area to design if it leans toward cutting ability. I sketched out a few shapes on scrap paper to get something that I liked, and ended up settling on this sort of cutlass shape that I could embellish with some extra ripples in the back to add mass to the center of percussion without compromising the edge. The tip of the blade will have a sort of cat's claw shape that allows for a sharper point than if the spine of the blade went straight up. With a profile shape that I like from a visual perspective set in stone, now I can try to understand the blade's function and overall premise. I need to ask myself, who would use a blade like this? Well, broad cutting blades aren't great against metal armor, and the short overall length of the weapon wouldn't be ideal for warfare or large battles, at least not as a primary weapon. I like the idea of close quarters, lightly armored skirmishes for a weapon of this type, so I think we will continue the design with the idea of this being a weapon of a corsair or pirate used for clearing the decks of ships. I already have this wavy protrusion on the back of the blade, so let's turn that into a depiction of an ocean wave. The hilt and pommel could have a serpent motif, which would really help set this sword apart from the mundane and into the realm of fantasy. I can start to imagine the wave trailing from behind the serpent, which evokes ideas of destruction and plunder being left in the wake of the wielder. A more ostentatious design will sell the high seas treasure motifs and explain the ornate work in the hilt construction. So, I guess we got our premise, a close-quarters skirmisher's sword with a cutlass/falchion-style blade belonging to a wealthy and successful corsair with much wealth to his name. I like what we've got so far, but before I start the painting, I need to give some brief consideration to the sword's construction if I want the design to be believable. Fantasy designs don't always need to be perfect in their construction, because most of the viewing audience wouldn't know the difference anyway. But I find that taking this step can answer many of my confusions and prevent unwanted roadblocks. Is the hilt one solid piece? Does the tang of the blade go all the way to the end of the pommel? How do the grip components stay on? These questions not only give us a better grasp of the construction, but they can also give you a baseline of shapes that you can start from instead of trying to overthink the process by making everything up from your own imagination. Let's not forget the purpose of this exercise, though. Functionality is all well and good, but if I end up with nothing more than an unadorned cruciform arming sword by the end, we haven't achieved our goal of creating a fantasy weapon, only a mere illustration of a historical item. Given that this is a painting, I have no actual cost restrictions in the sword's creation. Therefore, I can make this sword as ornate or as finely crafted as I want. So let's think more about the weapon's premise and see what we can add to help the design. The wave shape on the back of the blade reminds me of patterns I've seen in Chris-style daggers from parts of Indonesia. This will be a great element to add to really give this blade a subtle ocean theme. I've also decided to add a bit of jade to the grip, as it has a great seafoam green hue. The green also helps evoke the idea of a serpent. The serpent motif and other shape elements give the sword a cultural edge that looks like a cross between Renaissance falchions and Indian swords like the khanda. I like this sort of fusion of cultures. I think I will add elements to the final painting to emphasize these influences and help further the narrative surrounding the weapon. I've also decided to give the sword a name. I'll call it Serpent's Wake. This is unnecessary for the actual design, but titles can give things a lot of context and help you in the process of understanding the totality of what you're creating. Plus, you get to have more fun this way. Well, with all that workshopping done, I'm finally finished. Let's take a look at the final painting of Serpent's Wake. The goal of this painting was to reimagine realistic bladecraft into a fictional weapon, and I think I've managed to do that. I wanted the form of the sword to tell a story in and of itself. A short cut-and-thrust cutlass will tell a different story than a rigid spike of a blade. An ornate embellishment of jade and gold will tell a different story than a forged blackened finish, and so on. So many fantasy settings take place in grounded worlds, so it's fun to create weapons and armor that can cohabitate with realistic physics and material economy. While it can be great fun to go all out with bombastic designs, sometimes it can be better to appreciate the same attention to detail, sleek craftsmanship, and tactile satisfaction of a historical artifact that you can imagine holding in your hands. That is my goal when I create fantasy images, and I hope that I've inspired you to appreciate this goal as well. Stay tuned for more fantasy weapon designs to come. Thank you for watching.